Hello, everybody. I am your presenter, J Onwuka, bringing you something a little bit different than the recent videos. Well, wouldn't want to say recent. The last few videos that I have uploaded. Um, Basically, my channel has been mainly focused on D&D Blood War content, and I still am going to be producing those videos, but they do take a while to sort of, get to the finish line. And one of the things that I always wanted to do with this channel was to sort of just explore different ideas and different sort of stories that I can find in, you know, different varieties of media. Again, it's a similar idea to what I'm doing with the Blood War videos, but not as in depth as that. Um, so yeah, I'm going to be doing hopefully more frequent videos that are of a less structured variety, and then I am going to be putting out Blood War content as I can get it done. I'm going to shoot for, at the outside, one every 2 months. I know that is a slow release time, but that's when I've been sort of getting them out. As I, am able to sort of pick up my pace with that stuff, it'll get out sooner. But yeah, I just sort of didn't want to hold myself back from doing other things, especially stuff that's going to be a little bit easier for me to produce on a more regular basis. So that said, what I'm going to sort of present to you today is a kind of fleshed out history for the game Amid Evil. This game is developed, or this game was developed by Indefatigable, and it was published by New Blood Interactive. It came out in 2019. I just, when I first saw sort of footage of a medieval, it immediately captured me because it was this kind of like cosmic sci-fi fantasy, um, just pulled off the kind of game that I really wanted to play, which is a first-person shooter with projectiles. I understand, obviously bullets do travel in what to us is pretty instantaneous time, but I don't really find that as fun as being able to see all the dangers coming at you, being able to dodge them, or at least having that chance. So I've sort of just been smashing my way through this game. I think I'm actually quite near the sort of the end point of my playing of it for now. I've beaten the game through on the easy, medium, and hard difficulties. I'm at the final boss on the evil difficulty, and it's one of those situations where it's like, okay, I can just tell you're going to be a time sink, so I'm not sure if I want to go ahead and do that. But regardless, the point is that I'm not really the kind of person who finishes a lot of games. So for this game to have captured me so much that even though it's a pretty short game and it's not the hardest game I've ever played, but even despite these things, it still like grabbed me, to the point where I was willing to go back over, stuff that I'd already done. Yeah, it sort of just speaks to how much it grabbed me. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about it from a sort of storytelling perspective is that the backstory presented in the game is very sparse. You basically get what's in the codex, which is, maybe a brief blurb, maybe 50 words or so for each stage, a similar one for each enemy type that you run into. then blurbs for the weapons, and there's, a short history piece. Outside of that, you've just got messages that are written on walls and stuff inside the levels to give you a better idea of what happened. Because there were sort of all of these gaps, I thought, well, I basically, just had my brain sort of churning around, all of these different elements, and I decided to try and put them all together into something like a cohesive history. So that's basically what I am going to present for you today. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. I do want to sort of make a note at the beginning. I am not saying that what I'm going to present here is the actual backstory of a medieval, and I wouldn't even say that it's, there's no like definite signs pointing towards any part of this, right? For this, I'm really going just based off of what seems plausible, and it's just putting something together basically for fun. I guess you can consider it a fan theory about how all of these things fit together. But I do want to just sort of emphasize that I don't really have anything to do with Indefatigable or anybody who is, behind in medieval. So please do not take this as gospel. This might just be a fun way to sort of look at the game if you are playing through it yourself. So, I have a script here. I have not sort of gone through with a fine-tooth comb to edit everything, so I may amble off the track a little bit here and there, but, I'll try not to waste too much of your time, even though this is a kind of a time-wasty endeavor altogether. Anyway, let me just sort of, put a period on that, say that, I've introduced the subject well enough for right now, and let's get into it. The universe, at the time of the Champions campaign, had been dominated by the insidious and invisible evil force for thousands of years. This evil wasn't a person or an army. It was something like a psychic disease which drove people to hatred and disgust. Even after so long, its control was not yet complete, but every faction of note is at least partially guided by evil. The community of factions and peoples that make up what I will call the Second Empire are involved in countless wars, both within their groups and against outsiders. On the planet Astronomica, the holy sect of the moon on the dark side and the servants of the sun on the light side have engaged in a protracted war, seeking the upper hand so that they can wipe out their enemies. Both the Forge people and the Sentinels fell to evil and largely isolated themselves, further dampening the alliance. Mages who reject the prevailing order have gathered in the arcane expanse under a presumably corrupted being called the Archmage of Chaos. The crises and catastrophes compound upon each other. If the champion does not succeed, the ancients and their empire are sure to fall. To understand the importance of the champion's quest, we have to understand the universe and the backstory. What I will present here is what I think is a reasonable continuation of material presented in the game, both through gameplay and the in-game codex, which seem to be the only places so far for setting lore. For the record, this is being composed before the release of any medieval DLC, and it hasn't meant to step on any toes. I just enjoy fleshing out concepts that appeal to me. As an aside, sorry, I forgot how I had started this script. It's been sort of a delay between the times when I started and finished the script for this. So sorry that I'm going over stuff that I already went over, but I'm just reading through the script as I have it. Aside from the game material, I'm going to draw on our current knowledge of the Proto-Indo-European religion. I think this is appropriate because I see Amid Evil as taking place on a cosmic scale, with the fate of millions of whole civilizations in the balance. The kind of epic scale in which disrupting whole galaxies in order to use a few planets as bombs can seem a halfway sane proposition. The champion is called the first mortal to enter the gateway in eons, which certainly implies that immortals who have used the gate recently exist. Even if the champion is physically of a size with modern humans, the stakes and powers involved are greater than most can comprehend. So, this story plays out over a cosmic scale. How does the travel work? My assumption is that this is not a culture of starships, given that we don't see any. What we do see are portals. It's through these gates that contact between worlds is made. There is nothing given which states how these portals were made. That said, even though the champion only goes through portals that go from one place to another on the same world, and portals that connect to the gateway of the ancients, it does seem probable that portals would exist between two worlds without involving the gateway. How and why they would be made isn't as important as the idea of them, because we have no idea of the limits of magic power. However, the fact that the evil force infected so many worlds while apparently never entering the gateway does suggest that there were other routes for the evil to take. Now, I think I can move on and give you a possible history of the medieval setting. It begins before the beginning. Before there was anything, there was the sound. Ew. It reverberated endlessly as this sound woke up and became sentient. This sound was the begetter of all things, and it would become known as the celestial Thearch, ruler of the gods. After an incredible amount of time, the Thearch decided to have children. They created 3 children: the sovereign of the golden chariot, the sovereign of the holy mountain, and the sovereign of the 7 thunders, or, more simply, the dawn goddess, the earth goddess, and the storm god. The earth goddess and the storm god mated, and their child was the fire god, the sovereign of the fiery sword. The dawn goddess and the storm god mated as well, and their children were the sun god and the moon god, with their main title being scion rather than sovereign. I will touch on the reason for this later. For now, the gods, assembled now as they were, decided to create the universe and all of its creatures. As mortals of many different kinds flourished, the Thearch then mated with the dawn goddess to produce the divine twins, the avatar of courage and the avatar of wisdom. They were made purposefully to live among and inspire mortals, so they were described as being filled with divinity rather than radiating it as true gods did. This idea isn't really meant to hold up to scrutiny. I'm not saying that the avatars are weaker than sovereigns. It's meant to highlight their relationships. From the perspective of mortals, the Thearch and the sovereigns were meant to be worshipped, the scions to be venerated, and the avatars to be admired. This is also drawing from the Proto-Indo-European framework, where the Sky Father is at the top, primary deities are weather, earth, and fire, the sun and moon are of the next rank in development, and the divine twins are generally demigods or immortalized mortals, rather than fully fledged deities. What came next for the deities was simply their rule over creation. In this time, there would have been no question about the existence of the gods, since people could interact with them in the flesh. Also, it's likely that it would take quite a long time for mortals to master magic, meaning that gods appeared to be even more formidable. The roles of ruler and ruled were clear and indisputable. This time is called the First Age, which lasted many thousands of years. The rough continuum of regimes we know as ancient Egypt lasted for 2,700 years, while the Chinese imperial period lasted for 4,000. Given that, I don't think it's unreasonable to estimate that the reign of the gods lasted at least 50,000 years. We could call their regime something grand like the Empire of the Million Suns, or something simpler like the Divine Empire. Much like the monarchs of medieval Europe, even this limitless empire would probably be ruled at the top as if it were any other household asset. For the most important matters, an audience at the divine court is the arbiter of last resort. The celestial thearch sits over the proceedings, but the deity who truly conducts these hearings is the storm god. The storm god endeavors to be strictly procedural. When a petition is brought to the court, the earth goddess will usually speak on behalf of the petitioner, and the dawn goddess speaks against. Sometimes the roles are reversed. Most decisions are made through this interplay of advocate and prosecutor, which lasts until one side can frame their argument in the terms of the thearch's spoken law. At any time, the thearch could speak and immediately decide a matter, ending all debate. However, as is the case with most rulers, the thearch prefers when matters are decided by known and existing law. One of the first weapons you get in medieval is the Staff of the Azure Orb, created by the Azure Order. I decided to take this concept and expand it. The Azure Order are now an order of warrior mystics devoted to purity and balance. That's what I can gather from the Codex. Perhaps in the First Age, there were 4 orders, and the Azure are simply the only ones remembered. We can obviously start with the Azures, focused on purity and balance, with water as their element. They could be organized in a confederal system, with each of their bastions being led by an independent archmage. The other 3 orders would be as follows. The Vermilion Order, red rather than azure blue, focused on community and curiosity with the element of fire, likely a loose congregation of affiliated monasteries with no central structure. The Pearl Order, white, seeks elevation and avoidance. They have the element of air, probably highly monarchic with top-down appointments being common. The Ebony Order, black, motivated by power and fervor, idolizing earth. Run in a federated structure with the head monastery allowed to make decisions for all, but not usually involved in the branch monastery's internal decisions. In this setup, an archmage would be the leader of a single site, like a bastion, a monastery, and so on, while a grand magus would be at the head of all sites. These mystics would have been the first people to both know and worship the gods. Most people throughout the universe would never see a god themselves. The mystics of the 4 orders were primarily responsible for overseeing this endless population. They didn't rule in a legal sense, but one mystic could lay waste to vast stretches of a town by themselves, so they were listened to. The combination of force and sacred aura ensured that mortals did not stray too far from living in a way that the gods would approve of. The orders would undoubtedly have been seen as protectors of the gods. Aside from them, each deity also had a force of dedicated bodyguards known as guardians. These would be the forces in the coming conflict. Since the Azure Order created their staff, it's plausible that the orders would have been the drivers of magical study and refinement. These orders would be composed of members of created races, a description which includes the ancients, the ones who eventually recruited the champion. These orders would have worshipped the divine court directly and would have been familiar with portals and advanced magical weaponry. There were other peoples as well, ones who weren't at a cosmic level. It seems that crystal beings existed, but it is unclear the form they would have taken in this time. To understand what comes next, I have to lay out what the difference between gods and mortals is. A god in this context is possessed of two things: a limited immortality and incredible power. Gods don't age, and they are immune to mortal diseases, but they can be killed or choose to die. This is an incredible power, but it is probably not unique. The evil influenced beings, like the Moon Guardian, would be similarly immortal. It's the sheer magical power which sets the gods apart. In Dungeons and Dragons terms, mortals typically go from level 1, a starting adventurer, to level 20, where dragons would be routine enemies. Beings of a cosmic level, such as mystics of the orders, would be considered from level 20 to 30, simply above mortals. When mages accumulate enough souls, they can send themselves into a powered-up state, which is pseudo-deific, bringing their potential power up to a ceiling of about level 40. The actual gods are at level 50, with the Thearch alone being higher at 55. The gods of this universe are clearly more powerful than non-divine beings, but could still be destroyed by concerted effort. That's basically the point of all of those comparisons. The reason I brought this up is because the next events are so destructive. I should first mention that the Black Labyrinth was created during the First Age by the gods. It was made as a defense against total calamity, but in its first test, it was irrelevant. This first test was a great war between the gods, which I will call the War in Heaven. The old gods mentioned in the Codex are called old because they are of the last generation, the generation that died in this war I'm about to describe. The important takeaway from the War in Heaven is this: the old gods went away and the ancients took over. That much can be directly gathered from the Codex material. Because the War of the Gods is a common motif in Indo-European myth, I think that it is a fitting narrative for this shift. I will use the Norse myth of Ragnarok as the bones of this possible narrative. Before the war began, many millennia before, the celestial Thearch had forbidden all beings from pursuing what can be called Omega weapons, or god-killing weapons. This decree was accepted for a long, long while, but it was eventually broken. In secret, the Pearl Order developed its weapon, but it was discovered just as it was completed. From the Divine Court, the Thearch demanded that the weapon be destroyed. For the first time since time began, the Thearch decree was directly opposed. The one who interrupted was the Storm God, supposedly the Thearch's right hand. Nevertheless, the Thearch's word should have been heeded. Instead, the Storm God began to plot, as did the Pearl Order and others. The Storm God was joined by the Earth Goddess and the Fire God in deliberations. By this time, the Vermilion Order had taken it upon themselves to spy on the Storm God. They brought news of these meetings to the Celestial Thearch. The Thearch would have then summoned his court to assemble, finding that only the Dawn Goddess and the two avatars were with him. The revolt of the Storm God was real and could not be ignored. The war would soon span many worlds and planes of existence. It would devastate galaxies. Despite the particular objection, all involved knew that this conflict was about the Thearch's reluctance to recognize the Storm God as the chief deity. Those assembled remained loyal to the Thearch. Also, the Azure and Vermilion orders swore their service. The Dawn Goddess refused to have her children involved, though, and she hid the Sun God and the Moon God in the safe haven. The gods then made themselves ready for war, each empowering their own guardians. The first action of this war was the Ebony Order and the Pearl Order descending upon the Thearch's citadel. At the time, the Thearch was joined by the Avatar of Courage, so they and their guardians fought alongside one another. Providing cover for this surprise attack was the Earth Goddess accusing the Vermilion Order and sentencing them all to death. In return, the Avatar of Courage stated that the Vermilions would not be punished for any alleged crime as long as that arch-traitor, the Storm God, refused to bow to the Thearch. After this, no messages passed between the two sides, and they simply plotted their strategies. I am describing this conflict briefly, but in my mind, this war lasts for 1,000 years. The sides probably have multiple important sites to defend. Portals must be constructed, and sieges could last for centuries. The warfare of this period would probably consist of raids and occupations, or sieges, fairly unbounded by space in the way we normally think about it. An invading force may have to wait generations before finding a flaw in enemy defenses that they can use. The weapons used during this period would have been roughly equivalent to what was seen during the Champions campaign against the evil force. The Voltride, a trident that shoots lightning, is mentioned as once being common, so it seems fair that this period is when its popularity was at its height. This would certainly be the choice weapon of the Guardians of the Storm God, referred to in the Codex as the Holy Warriors of the Lightning Lands. Of the weapons used by the champion, only the Voltride and possibly the Staff of the Azure Orb, which fires blasts of water, existed in their later forms. From the use by the champion's enemies, it seems clear that a laser shooting sword of some kind has existed since early in the First Age, even if they weren't as sophisticated as the Whisper's Edge. Melee weapons were common among frontline troops. The Staff of Torment, a spike-throwing mace, may have existed in some form prior to and during the war. The Celestial Claw definitely would not have existed during the First Age, as that would have been a threat to the rule of the gods. Finally, the Aeternum isn't given any history or detail, so it's impossible to say when it emerged. It was possibly a version of the Omega weapon at the heart of the war in heaven. It could be totally unrelated. We'll just have to leave that question open for now. The first god to fall in the war in heaven was the Avatar of Courage. Undaunted by the overwhelming power of the Storm God, this avatar and their guardians fought their way to the Storm God's sanctuary. Here, after a valiant battle, the Avatar of Courage was cut down by the Storm God. Those of the Avatar's guardians, which did not lie dead immediately, fled the field of battle. The next great battle came when the Fire God discovered a portal which he hoped would lead him to power or advantage. It led him instead to the citadel of the Dawn Goddess, his mother's sister, but also an ally of the Thearch. The Fire God didn't hesitate to engage in battle, and the Dawn Goddess met him fiercely. The two gods and their attendant guardians raged in battle until a freak accident of magic engulfed the sanctuary in radiant flame, leaving nothing but ruins. Incensed by the death of their twin, the Avatar of Wisdom launched a vengeance attack on the Ebony Order. The Avatar infiltrated the Order's citadel and wrought havoc in a terrifyingly deadly display. The Ebony Order never ceased their barrage of attack on the Avatar, but it didn't save them. In return for the Order's murder of their sibling, the Avatar of Wisdom laid them all to waste. And yet, the Avatar had gained little. Once they crossed the portal away, they died from the accumulated wounds that the Ebony Order had laid on them. The Thearch's war against the Pearl Order seemed finally to be nearing its end. The loyal Azure Order had worked with the Thearch's guardians to wear down the Pearl defenses. The Thearch now led the charge through the portal to the Pearl Sanctuary. Immediately upon arrival, the Pearl Order's Omega weapon was unleashed, annihilating the Celestial Thearch in an instant. The Thearch's guardians launched into battle, but they would have been defeated had the Azure Order not arrived. The Azures attempted to destroy the Omega weapon, devastating the Ebony Order in a flood of magic, almost completely wiping them out. The death of the Thearch sent his allies into paroxysms of grief. This was what led the Vermilion Order to throw everything into destroying the Earth Goddess. As they passed portal after portal, their numbers dwindled until a few Vermilion heroes were all that remained to finally infiltrate the sanctuary. They made their way to the center point and engaged a bomb which completely obliterated the sanctuary, along with all inside. Now it was the Storm God's turn to suffer bitter grief. His wails of agony shook mountains and blasted fertile lands until they were barren. In the midst of this dolor, refugees from the Pearl Order delivered the Omega weapon into his hands. As soon as it became true, this gift was known to all great powers of the universe. Those which remained frantically sped toward the Storm God. Some perhaps wanted to swear allegiance, but most were intent on taking the Omega weapon from the Storm God. It didn't matter why they had come, though. When they arrived by their various means, a great battle erupted between the Storm God's soldiers and would-be adherents on one side, with the other side being the rest of the celestial beings. As the battle neared the Storm God's throne room, he unleashed the full power of the Omega weapon, destroying the world they fought on, all people in and on it, and the Omega weapon itself. The war in heaven ended not in a surrender, but in total annihilation. Less than 1% of those who fought in the war in heaven would have survived it. As far as anyone knew at that time, none of the divines had survived. Those few divine attendants and order remnants slowly regained contact with one another. There were two general tendencies among these: those who wanted to continue looking after worlds under divine protection, and those who wanted to pursue other goals and leave mortals to fend for themselves. The eclectic mix of celestials who decided to remain, as it were, would likely have called themselves caretakers or stewards, something like that, but they are better known, in the time of the champion, as the Ancients. Eventually, enough of these first Ancients connected that they could truly aid and protect those beings who had so depended upon the gods before the war. This was the beginning of the Second Age. Though many people viewed the Ancients as gods, the Ancients did not have nearly the power of the deities. For one thing, Ancients could only travel between worlds and dimensions by portals. But this would involve them having someone at both ends, which would be very onerous for them to achieve. That said, the Ancients would have a leg up if a kind of transport hub already existed. Since the Ancients and those of lesser power always did exist, it's plausible that this sort of place had been created with the help of the gods. I think the best assumption is that the Ancients secured one of these terminals to give them access to many of the worlds which had been in the Divine Empire. This place is what the champion comes to know as the Gateway of the Ancients. Even the wide boulevards and easy ramps of its design suggest it was originally a transfer point for many, many people. The demands of power can curdle even the best intentions, however. As the Ancients became more secure in their position, they would have remained aware of all those Celestials who had decided to pursue their own ends. Most Ancients would have seen these outsiders as a threat. By considering a dark but common chapter in the history of new regimes, we can put the Sentinels and the Forge people into that story. I think the Ancients would have tried to wipe out the dissidents and used these two peoples to do it. The Sentinels would have been the muscle in this operation. It's unknown when the noted Sentinel xenophobia began, but if it wasn't pushed on them by the Ancients, it was at least informed by this type of action that they were being hired to do. The Forge people, working under their father creator, the Forge Master, provided the weaponry which the Sentinels used to assault the Celestials. Very likely, neither was much aware of the other. The Ancients seem likely to have obscured reasons or recipients from anyone who would be interested in that information. Instead, the Sentinels and Forge people likely would have been given a version of the pitch given to many vassal states: do our bidding and fight our enemies, in return for which we will reward you and not interfere in your affairs. Given how such campaigns go in history, this wave of sanctioned killings would have claimed anything from 25 to 90% of the quote-unquote apostate Celestials. Regardless, it would have confirmed the Ancients as the undisputed successors of the Divine Court. Once this campaign ended, the Ancients began to steward the empire they had won. Things progressed without much change for countless generations, centuries, and millennia. The Ancients guided those who sought guidance. They watched civilizations rise and fall, saving some for a time, but never forever. At some point, most likely in this extended peace of the Ancients, people of the planet J claimed to have received revelations from the Sun God and the Moon God. Many Celestials, both Ancients and the remaining apostates, took interest and traveled to J. Some became convinced that these gods had survived, especially as they had not been seen since the war began. The planetary sun and moon became stand-ins for the gods, and the two religions became accepted by the Ancients. In this time, the Ancients would have established the Sacred Path, a trial undertaken for pleasure by the Ancients and their selected mortal friends. Its destination was a well of energy which we must assume was rejuvenating, awe-inspiring, or both. This great peace would be undone by the evil force's arrival. It isn't clear where the force crept in from or how it arrived first. A good candidate, in my opinion, is the rise of the Archmage of Chaos. This figure clearly started a rebellion against the status quo, not only striking out past the reach of the Ancients, but also bringing many brilliant mages with them to be the base of their new Order of the Eclipse. I think it's possible that the Archmage was one of the first to fall under the sway of evil. Another candidate for the first corrupted is the fabled Pilgrim who unwittingly spread evil throughout the Sacred Path. However it first arrived, the evil force eventually came to influence nearly all worlds which the Ancients governed. Perhaps the Ancients should have been able to fight the evil, but they were not. It seems as though the evil force worked very gradually, too slowly for the Ancients to recognize before it was too late. Likely, the Ancients did fight the evil force at times without knowing it. Attempts to flush out the eclipse, for instance, probably went on for a very long time before the force was recognized for what it was. Regardless of how it came to be, there did come a time when the great factions who supported the Ancients had all fallen to evil. The holy sect of the Moon and the servants of the Sun became consumed by hatred of all outsiders, but of their opposite devotees most of all. The Sentinels were dominated by a pustulant, parasitic being of evil called the Scrounge. The Forge Master appeared to have somehow been directly corrupted, meaning the mechanicals of the great forges were hostile to all others. The Order of the Eclipse grew in size and in fanaticism, its mages gleefully accepting evil in exchange for power. The Gateway remained uncorrupted by the time of the Champion's arrival. This was likely due to intense effort on the part of the Ancients. It is clear that the evil force doesn't have to necessarily work through a medium. It can corrupt at will. This effort on their part ties into why the Ancients finally summoned a champion. Most likely, this was not their first option. I think that the Ancients, which the champion meets after their ultimate victory, may be all that remain, the others having perished struggling against the evil force in some manner. Only once the Ancients themselves could do little more than protect the Gateway would they have summoned a champion. Now I come to my final point. What is the evil force? Narratively, a totally abstract evil enemy is not that interesting. For the purpose of the game, though, it's perfectly fine, but I have a notion which is a little bit more metaphysical. Let me lay it out here. What if we assume that true metaphysical creation requires a male part and a female part? Ideas like this can be found in works of spiritual alchemy, one prominent example being the pair of Red King and White Queen, and they're also common in mythology. Speaking of mythology, there are a variety of ways in which creation and existence begin in various mythologies. Some believe that one deity fashions everything. People interested in polytheistic religions will be familiar with an alternative, a fairly incestuous list of primordial gods which at some point result in the world we know. In these systems, the first gods arise in various ways as well. A male first god and a female first god arising together, a first god who creates many children who then mate among each other, spontaneous creation of a one by a one, and so on. I raise these ideas to try and bring you to the kind of narrative space that I'm entering now. Think back to the beginning of the discussion when I said that the Thearch created the other gods. Let's assume now that a male-female pair is the only way to create a divinity. How then could the celestial Thearch have created the other gods? Another common trope, which exists even now in an altered form, is that each soul is hermaphroditic, having male and female parts. Yet another is the idea of a single parent creating another, such as Athena springing fully formed from Zeus's head. With these in mind, here is my somewhat eclectic suggestion. In order to create the other gods, the Thearch first separated his female essence from himself to create a divine mother, with which he could conceive and produce children. I assume the Thearch is male primarily because the motif of the Skyfather is present in most Indo-European polytheisms, and these are the ones that are known by most people, even if they're not their native mythological system. And in these systems that have the Skyfather, the mother usually has a somewhat reduced role, to varying degrees. The reason that I did not talk about this divine mother figure before was that, at first, her presence was primarily conceptual. Think about the Egyptian creation myth featuring Atum, who created his children by masturbating. The hand is often seen as the female principle working in this act of creation. So, at first, this divine mother figure was not a created god. The issue which led this to change is the Thearch's failure to re-reconcile these two parts back into one. This metaphysical tension created the seed of the evil force. Over time, this seed began to spread its roots. It's possible that the war in heaven was actually an early effect of this. Even if it wasn't, though, the end of the war was also the point of no return. The Thearch's death meant that there would never be a reconciliation. What is interpreted as evil, then, is mostly a hatred of all things that are traceable to the Thearch. Though this idea is esoteric, I like it because it involves the metaphysical/divine in a way that still relates to the broad context of the champion's exploits. So, at the time that the champion goes on their campaign to try and vanquish the evil force, pretty much the entire Second Empire is in disarray. The evil force has infected all parts of it. The various groups which had been the support of the ancients have fallen away. All that's left are the few ancients that remain, guarding the gateway and ensuring that there's some kind of continuation. What will happen afterwards is not really clear. Obviously, we don't really get any update on, let's say, what happens to the holy sector of the moon after you defeat the Moon Guardian. We just don't know these answers, and I don't really want to speculate further than that. I think historical speculation is great and really fun, and that's also somewhat possible by extrapolating from, evidence that we have. But trying to predict the future is a whole different ball game. So I think that I'm going to leave that for other people to do. Hopefully, the developers, when we get in the Medieval 2, I know there's a DLC coming out. And again, now that we're at the end, I do want to say I don't have any sort of insight. I do expect that DLC to, add some major contradictions to what I'm presenting here. But again, this is sort of just for fun. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Thank you to my patron ValdesShadow12. If you'd like to sign up for my Patreon, it's patreon.com/NearZone. My Patreon is not really built on the model of you give me money, I produce X content. I am trying to do more content, but it's just like, if you're interested in the kind of things that I'm doing, throw me a couple bucks. It'll help me out a little bit. That said, like I said, hopefully you enjoyed this rundown. I will be doing different things, some in this vein as far as just doing the talk. Something that I don't have to sort of go through the whole process of really sort of, editing a lot of moving parts in the video. Let me stop sort of rambling. If you stuck with me this far, I've just got one thing to say. Thanks.